A Mongolian prisoner screams out from what can only be called a coffin. His words only bounce off the wooden walls where he's confined. To some extent, this man that broke the law is buried alive. In the box which serves for a cell, there is at least air to breathe. And perhaps once a day he'll receive a morsel of food and enough water to keep him alive. It's winter, and the man is shivering so bad his teeth constantly chatter, his only protection being a sheepskin that the prison has so kindly given him. As one writer who witnessed this scene put it, he is suffering the tortures of the damned. Welcome to the hell of a Mongolian coffin prison, a place where Middle Ages brutality persisted in modern times. Before we upset the Mongolian government or mislead our dear viewers, we should explain to you that the scene we just described we took from a book called Across Mongolian Plains, and it was written by an American explorer named Roy Chapman Andrews. The book was published in 1921, so we expect that Mongolian prisons have improved somewhat since then. First, we'll take a look at these hellish coffin prisons, and later we'll explain to you just how things have improved since 1921. We'll just let you know right now that when Mongolian prisons are talked about today, you still hear the words cruel and inhumane. But the question is, how much of a step up from the coffins are these new prisons? Okay, so if in 1921 you walked into that prison, what you'd see is an entrance to a wooden enclosure, and that's what you might call the prison walls, and the wooden fence posts were spiked at the end. The prisoners were in fact outside, and that's why so many men died during those cold winter months. Inside this fenced-off area are small houses, and if you would have walked into one of those houses, you would have not been able to see much. They were more like small dungeons. These did not keep out the cold, but at least shielded the inmates from the vicious winds. But these rooms are not where the men stayed. That would have been too good for them. What were actually inside the rooms were piled wooden boxes, about 4 feet long by 2.5 feet high, about the size of a cage where you might keep a dog if you were a cruel kind of person. Those boxes were the men's cells, and they were so cramped that all they could do was sit in them all scrunched up, hence coffin prisons. Hardly any light got into the boxes, and so the men's vision after time, not to mention their sanity, was very negatively affected. But it gets even worse. To ensure that the men didn't escape from those coffins, some of them had their necks chained to a pair of manacles that fastened around their hands. When it was feeding time, a jailer would push a small amount of food through a small hole in the coffin. And we expect for a manacled man, eating wasn't exactly that easy. For the fortunate men who'd committed lesser crimes, the coffin torture might only last a few weeks or months, which would be enough, we imagine, to break anyone watching this show. But others would spend years or even their entire life in those boxes, which according to the book we just talked about, would result in some men losing the use of their limbs, which shrink and shrivel away. Okay, so one source isn't really adequate, and perhaps the American explorer was exaggerating a little. We're gonna say that we believe him though, because we found a news clipping online from the New Zealand Herald of a story titled "Immured in Coffins, Mongolian Barbarity." The article was written by someone who just traveled to Mongolia and had visited the prisons. Here's some of the text. The prisons and dungeons of the Far Eastern country contain a number of refined Chinese shut up for life in heavy iron-bound coffins, which do not permit them to sit upright or lie down. These prisoners see daylight only for a few minutes daily when the food is thrown into their coffins through a small hole. The photo you're about to see is a depiction and shows the boxes not stacked but just lying around. The small size of the boxes is quite shocking. If you're wondering why Chinese folks were locked up in those boxes as well as Mongolian prisoners, the reason was the Chinese had invaded the country. They managed to occupy some regions but not others. That's not something we'll get into today. We found some more research about these coffins and found out that the human waste was collected from them every 2 to 3 weeks, so you can only imagine the stench. Some sources say that some inmates might stay in the box for only a few weeks, and this was more like a stern warning to them. Most inmates in the coffins were sentenced to death, but many died in the coffins before the death sentence could be carried out. To see how things have improved, we had to look at Amnesty International reports from the 90s and early 2000s. We'll go out on a limb here and say that the new prison sounded better than the coffins, but those reports said the prisoners were tortured, neglected, and if a prisoner had no outside connections, then they would often starve to death. There is evidence of people being locked up without due process, and evidence of prisoners having their food held back so they would confess a crime, whether they committed it or not. Amnesty wrote that deliberate starvation would sometimes lead to the death of pretrial prisoners, and in the period from 1993 to 1994, 90 inmates died inside one prison. 15 to 30 prisoners were said to have died of starvation, the rest from illness or work accidents. We should say that Mongolian officials denied this and said prisoners were given enough food rations to survive. A medical professional in Mongolia said this wasn't true at all, and he said many men died from immune system suppression, which was all the result of starvation or malnutrition. Even recently, children have found themselves locked up with adults. There was now a famous case in 2008 where a child was given 7 years in prison for stealing some wine and chocolates. In 2017, a report by the National Human Rights Commission said prisoners were still being kept in inhumane conditions. It said unnecessary force as well as degrading treatment was used to extract confessions from prisoners. It's difficult to find first-hand accounts as to how the prisons are now, although some photos can be found online which give an impression of what life might be like inside a prison. According to the British government that has a webpage dedicated for Brits locked up in Mongolian prisons, prisoners do now receive enough food and medical care, and conditions aren't anything as bad as we've described in the past. Saying that, if you've ever read a book by a Brit who's been locked up in a prison in a distant nation, they'll tell you that the British Embassy can't do that much. It's actually the smaller humanitarian organizations, such as Prisoners Abroad, who provide the most help. We'll leave it at that, and we hope none of you ever appear in a Locked Up Abroad episode. But just in case you're wondering what it might be like to get locked up overseas, have a look at this gritty video. You don't want to be sent to this prison, worst prison in the world in 2019. Or if you can't bear to hear any more about prisons, hit this one up.